Hi, everyone. Welcome to this first session of our newly forming BC Community of Practice for Patient Engagement in Clinical Trials. And this first session today is actually a presentation. So we've opened that up to a wider audience. We will be recording the presentation and the discussions today for those that can't attend and posting them on the BCHSN website, most likely in the BC Support Unit Resources section and potentially on Clinical Trials BC website as well. We have people coming from all across BC joining us today and nationally across Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land that I work and on which I work and live and play is the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Bitsi, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. Just a little background, the idea for our community of practice grew out of some discussions between the BC Support Unit Vancouver, Fraser Regional Centre, and Clinical Trials BC, along with two patient partners who are here with us today, and those folks and some clinical research investigator. We started talking a lot about patient engagement in clinical trials and then participated and hosted a panel at the Clinical Trials BC conference 2 weeks ago. That recording will become available next week on the Clinical Trials BC website. But this community of practice that we're looking to form as a result of that collaboration. And we do invite anybody interested in advancing their learning in this area of patient engagement specific to clinical trials. We invite you to join our monthly meetings that will be, we expect, a combination of informal discussions and chats, journal reviews perhaps, hosted speakers, and more. And the members will develop this based on the needs of the community. But for today, we are really pleased to host a presentation focused on methods, followed by some discussion. And the title of this talk today is Co-Designing Clinical Trials with Patients. And here to speak to us about that is Nick Vansbach, who is an associate professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC. And Nick is also the co-lead of the Health Economics and Simulation Methods Cluster at the BC Support Unit. And I see Mark has joined, and Mark Harrison is an associate professor in Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences at UBC. Over to you, Nick, and thank you and Mark for speaking to us today.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna, I think you'll see Mark. Do you want to wave, Mark? I had to send him the invite, so he's got the same name, just to confuse you all. I'm Nick, and I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do like a short presentation. I don't want this to be sort of like a formal presentation. I thought this would be a little bit more informal. And we'll talk for 20 minutes, and then we won't go into sort of details of the methods, but happy to sort of answer questions afterwards, or have a broader discussion afterwards about this sort of topic. So I hope that's okay. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll start off, and I think I'll hand over to Mark sort of halfway through, just to give you a different voice to listen to. So hopefully you can see that. Perhaps give me a thumbs up. Okay. So just some acknowledgements. I think this is a project that was funded by the BC Support Unit, the methods cluster that I sort of co-lead. Around sort of health economics. And arguably I shouldn't be the person who's talking about this, but this really was a sort of team effort. And here is a list of the team members, including our patient partners. And actually the story of this project starts with our patient partners, actually a conversation with one of them at a conference, a scleroderma conference, where there was a bit of frustration about the talk about new trials and how the patients weren't really being engaged with those trials. And that sort of like stemmed to sort of a beginning of conversations quite a few years ago, which have led us to sort of this sort of methods project with a kind of case study. And it's included a whole bunch of people, including Marie Hudson, who's there at the bottom, who's at McGill, who is a trialist who does design trials in this space. But just, so I'm going to set up the problem and sort of the idea that we approach this with, and then I'll hand over to Mark to give us some sort of the case study of where we've got to so far. But the problem that we're trying to address here is that we spend a whole bunch of money on clinical research, on trials, and like there's a lot of question marks about whether that offers good value for money. Like, so I'm an economist. I look at this from a sort of an economic lens, and that suggests that if we're wasting money on a trial over here, that means that money can't be spent on something that might be more useful. And so how can we sort of like optimize and really invest our money in the best way that's actually really going to improve the health of our populations? And someone called John Ioannidis wrote quite a provocative paper a few years ago, and in it he sort of said that most clinical research is not useful, and he gives this sort of like quote at the bottom, and it's he brings a whole bunch of reasons about why clinical research isn't useful from the start, from the question that's being addressed through to sort of it not being accessible to actually change any sort of practice. But if you just look at the last line here, it really strikes a note with me. He argues that a lot of clinical research fails not because of its findings, but because of its design. And just to go push that a bit further, I think we'd argue that many clinical trials study interventions that patients might not actually want to use, even if the studies are a success. And it depends on how you define success, but often trials are, a successful trial is defined by whether it meets its primary endpoint. And that's what determines whether it gets published in a big journal, whether it makes a splash on the newspapers. But sometimes, and there's good evidence for this, those primary endpoints aren't important to patients. They're something that might have some clinical meaning, but for patients, they're just one factor, but not maybe the most important factor. Maybe this sort of effect size, so the improvement that the study is being designed around isn't big enough to be meaningful. We see lots of trials of very small sort of improvements are being studied. Perhaps they don't give all the information that's needed, so they might focus on one outcome but not ignore some of the side effects, for example. And so it's a successful trial, but it has potentially some side effect that we don't know about. So is that really success? And then if you try and weigh this together, like, is the benefit that's being seen actually big enough to compensate for some of the risks? And then lastly, and there's other things as well, but it could also be just that the treatment or the intervention is just not practical, like the delivery. You have to travel, you have to use an injection. There's various reasons that actually this successful trial may not be useful. And I think this also contributes sort of earlier on. It actually is, there's many reasons for why patients don't participate in trials, but if the trial isn't studying an intervention that you actually would like to use, then that's a pretty reasonable reason for why people don't participate in clinical trials. So if we just sort of step back and think about away from health, how do we design things? And sort of like try and take consider this from a non-health perspective and then sort of reframe it. That's what we did in this project a few years ago. And if you look at sort of consumer good development, things like cars and phones and things like this, they start off with an idea that is sort of initially screened to see whether this is something that people would like, maybe some prototypes developed, and then there's this market research, actually going out to the people who might purchase this good and say, you know, would you actually buy this? And what are the features that you would want for this to be important to you sufficiently so that you will be willing to spend some of your own money on it. And then that market research will develop some tests, so see actually what we can actually make, how does it actually work in practice, and then go on, develop it, and if all goes well, enters the market. And just like these just looking at the costs of these stages, it costs money to sort of do this testing and then develop a market entry. And so you want to be sure that you're developing a product that is going to be sold, like people will want to buy it before you actually put it out into the market. And often this market research suggests that actually, our prototype isn't working. So we need to sort of redevelop the prototype, change it somewhat. And maybe it's prototype 2 that goes forward, or maybe it's not. And maybe you have to create prototype 3. And actually that's the one that seems to be the one that's going to likely to work. Or you might just get to a stage where, this isn't going to happen. So let's just can this now. Let's not go and waste money on developing something that people don't actually want. Now, if you take the same perspective into the health realm, I think you similarly have ideas that are screened and prototyped. But what we would argue is that the market research part is missing. Or there is market research that often happens, but it often's not with the end users, the consumers, the patients that are actually the intervention is for. And so we go forward with testing with these interventions and then developing them and putting that into the market. But we don't necessarily know whether it's something people would want. And some people can argue that actually this is what peer review does, but I've sat on many peer review panels and I can tell you that's not what peer review is doing. Peer review is trying to see whether a trial is designed in a sort of like the appropriate way. It's not understanding whether this is actually something that people want. And so the trials are the testing stage there. And actually the market research seems to actually happen once it's out into the market. So we develop this, we've spent all this money on a trial, it comes up with successful results, and then we find that actually patients don't really want it. And what a waste of resources that potentially is there. And this is like trying to sort of give the example of why Ioannidis suggests that much research is not useful. And so what happens in market research? So like very crude example of how when they developed phones, they ask people questions. These prototypes, they ask them, well, how important is battery life and cost and how much memory in the camera? And they ask people to sort of trade off in these types of questions to actually help disentangle which components of a product are important and how important must they be in order for me to sort of pay $300-400 for that product. Actually, it's a sort of famous story that the iPhone, when it was first developed, they delayed actually manufacturing it until they knew they could get 10 hours of battery life, because they knew that was the magic number they needed before it was going to be considered valuable enough for people to spend their money on. Sometimes I'm not sure I even get 10 hours out of my phone these days. But anyway, in theory, that's what they should be doing. And so what our approach is trying to do is to sort of, how can we consider these techniques of market research earlier on in the process? And we're using a case study of patients with scleroderma, where there is some exciting new developments in stem cell therapies. And we want to sort of think through how can we design a future trial that might be more appealing for patients in the end. And I think just before I hand over to Mark, just to give you the heads up, Mark, that it's coming your way. I think we're just being realistic here, that we're focusing on pragmatic kind of modifiable factors here. Like there has to be some constraint to what is being considered. And so we're thinking about things in the design that can be changed. rather than just sort of opening everything else up. And so I'll hand over to Mark and let you, well, actually, no, I'm controlling the slides. So perhaps you talk, Mark, and I can do the slides and you can keep us going forward. Does that sound okay?
Sure, I think you should be able to predict when I need to change. So thanks, Nick. Yeah, so this, our case study hangs around a trial that was done a few years ago and published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And if you kind of cast your mind back to when Nick was saying about the project we were involved in being initiated by conversations with patients and a clinician, I was at a meeting where experts were getting together about this new stem cell therapy and how we could sort of move towards implementation in Canada. And so they talked about this Scott trial. It was a big trial designed for 226 participants, and stem cell therapy is quite a risky but potentially effective treatment. And they designed this trial with event-free survival as the primary endpoint. In reality, though, they had really low recruitment, so they only managed to recruit about 33% of the people they intended to. So because they could only get 75 people, they first tried to broaden the entry criteria to try and get more people into this trial. And when that failed, they then sought ways to try and work out how they could run the trial with this reduced sample size that they had. And what they ended up doing was changing from event-free survival as the primary endpoint to this global rank composite score, which kind of evaluates a number of different outcomes in order. And it ranges from survival right through to the Rodman skin score at the end, which is kind of just an indicator of skin involvement. And the results they come out with, I always feel a bit nervous talking about this because it's really hard. I find it really hard to understand, but I think that's okay, because that was kind of the point that the clinicians and the patients were making to me, is that in a clinical consultation, it's really hard to use this information to guide what's coming out of the trial. And if you think about all the different outcomes you've got, so survival, event-free survival, various things right through to that skin involvement, I think what happens is you make pairwise comparisons of everyone in the trial and then evaluate each outcome in order. So if you look at panel A, you can see that there's the black section at the bottom, and out of the 75 people in the trial, there were 17 deaths. So those black sections just indicate that there were 17 people in that trial who did worse than 58 others. And then you can see how they're distributed between the two treatment arms. And ultimately what they did was they looked at the median score on this global rank composite score and looked across at that 50 point and found that for the transplantation group, it was 17, whatever that means in practice, and it was -6 for cyclophosphamide. So there's an indication that the transplantation group was doing better, and that's how they evaluated the trial. I think we'll move on from that, Nick. So that kind of led to us trying to understand whether there was something in the design of that trial that might have helped the trial initially hit its participation or its uptake, recruitment targets, and whether there was something in the type of research that we do that could help people try and work out if there's something ahead of time that they could modify which would help that process of recruiting people into trials, and then ultimately having trials designed to evaluate things that are of interest to people. So our approach was to do a discrete choice experiment, which was very similar to the example that Nick showed you with the camera. And the good thing about this, like it was a completely patient involved project from the outset, but the process is that we first need to understand what's important to people to know what to put into those kind of experiments. So we co-designed patient focus groups to try and see what should be put into those choices. And this was quite interesting. The things that came out, and you can see the rank of themes that came out of the focus groups that we did with patients. The most important thing was this support of a multidisciplinary team through the recovery from the stem cell treatment. So they were talking about kind of social, emotional, a broad range of supports for them as they recover from a treatment or considered going in for a treatment. And they were talking about things like a broad range of issues, but also things around isolation and how it's a difficult decision and it can be quite a lonely decision. So this support was really important to them. They also talked a lot about logistics, so how costly to them individually it was to try and consider going for this treatment. And then there was a sort of layered on logistical concern about having to travel for treatment. So it's often offered in specialist treatment centres, which may be quite far from home, which is a logistical concern in its own right, and then layers less a multiplier effect with the financial risks as well. So when they're thinking about financial risks, it's coming out of their pocket, and they're thinking about how they're going to have to deal with that financial risk. Would you have to borrow money and do things like that? Then we get on to knowledge and evidence. So how good are the estimates that people are showing? Is the data that the information that they're being told based on Canadian data, like people, or, close to home evidence, or is it international data? How good was the experience of people who've undergone the treatment and what the doctor would recommend? And then finally, they got onto sort of the physical risk of treatment and the effectiveness of benefits, which are kind of the things that we tend to think about as researchers as starting out. Like we think the outcomes are the most important to people rather than these other supporting aspects like financial risk, logistical concerns, and things like that. So ranked 5 out of 6 was the thing that was most closely linked to or relating to the primary outcome of the Scott trial. So that was a really interesting part of the project for us. We assumed this would be the first as well because we come from that perspective, but it ranked quite far down the list of things that people were telling us they were most concerned with. So once we had all that information, we put it into the discrete choice experiment, which I'm just going to show you briefly here. We kind of use Word in consultation with our patient partners on the project to try and communicate that in a clear way. And then people would make choices between 2 different types of stem cell transplants or doing no stem cell transplant for now. So 2 times treatment or doing nothing. And once people have made a series of choices along those lines, we can then try and understand what's important to people if we send this out to a big panel of patients. We've been careful, like this has been a big learning experience for us going through a sort of fully patient-involved project as well. So we've been careful to try and document what we've done and what we've learned from this patient-oriented approach as well. So we had a couple of publications in the patient recently. One that was kind of more about the research process, which is the top paper published by my postdoc Magda. And then really pleasingly, Tiasha Birch, who was our patient partner, she wanted to give an accompanying piece which kind of laid out her experience of being involved in the research project as well, and what had gone well and what had gone perhaps less well. So we're trying to have 2 companion pieces for other people who are interested in taking this approach forward to see what we did, and then a sort of independent perspective on what went well and why, and if things had gone less well, why those had gone less well as well. So we're trying to disseminate as we go about what we're learning from the process. In terms of the survey, we worked with SPIN, who've got a huge panel of people with scleroderma who respond to surveys quite a lot. So we put our survey out to 278 people. We got a range of responses back from people with different types of scleroderma, including those who would be candidates for this kind of treatment if their condition was severe enough. Good representative sample across the board, and we had responses from across the world. So almost half from Canada, but we also had about 6 or 7 other different countries as well responding. And what we found is that actually when people were starting to make trade-offs between all of those things that we were told were important, outcomes actually were one of the big priorities. So if you read this from left to right, you can sort of see as we travel from left to right, the more influential things in people's decision making. So years without further organ damage, which is kind of closely related to the primary outcome, that was looking like the most important, as well as the complications. But then in the middle, we got to cost, the distance of the treatment centre from home, and then things like the experience of the surgeon and members of the care team to the right-hand side. And although they weren't the priority, they were actually influencing people's outcomes. So we can use this information on preferences to try and predict whether people would take a treatment. And the first thing we did was try and replicate the uptake rate of the Scott trial. So we used attributes from the choice, or sorry, descriptive words from those choice sets to try and replicate Scott trial. And we found with the type of outcome that they were looking at in that trial, we were able to do a pretty good job of predicting that 33% uptake from the trial based on the preferences that we got from people with scleroderma. Then what we did is we tried to adapt, hypothetically adapt the Scott trial and say, if they'd change some of the things which are kind of modifiable, so not the primary outcome or some of the risks, but if we said the treatment was being offered nearer to home or at less cost to the individuals who were being asked to undergo the treatment, we then predicted uptake from that kind of adaptation. And we saw that there was an improvement of potential participation in the trial from about 33%, potentially up to about 45–50% in that scenario. So this gives us a feel that if we try and understand what patients prioritise and what's important to them alongside primary outcomes and risks of treatments, that we may be able to help people who are planning trials to design something that's more likely to hit the recruitment rates that they've got in mind, but are also more relevant to the patients that we're trying to do the research for. So what we've learned is that we think that co-design in itself is a value, because obviously it's involving people who are ultimately going to benefit from the trial or want to use the treatments that we're looking at. But we think the involvement of patients helps us identify aspects of treatments that are really important to patients but may be missed by clinicians. We think we can predict uptake of interventions and perhaps try and use that to anticipate recruitment to further trials. And as a bundle, this might help us work with people to help design trials that have a better chance of being useful in practice. And actually what we're proposing is relatively inexpensive, and it's quick to achieve compared to actually doing with the clinical studies themselves. We have some kind of scleroderma specific findings that multidisciplinary teams and helping patients with the logistics of being in a trial or having treatment is going to be important. And then this has given us quite a lot of excitement about whether we can use this approach more broadly to help people in any kind of realm who are looking to conduct trials, and see whether we can work with them to try and design more patient-oriented trials and to help the recruitment process and the design process in future. But yeah, we'd love to hear from you about what your perspective on the work is. So thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And just, we're going to put some results of this, like we're still sort of in the middle of it. It's still, well, we're nearly at the end. We're trying to get it published right now, but we'll put those results on our website, and please sort of feel free to sort of reach out if you've got ideas or questions about that. And we're happy to answer the questions about this particular study now, but also happy to sort of just have a broader conversation about the topic. So don't feel like we have to sort of focus in on this specifically. We're really just keen to sort of use this as an opportunity to start these kind of conversations, which we think could be so valuable for our community.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Mark. I hope we do have a lot of questions. I'll monitor the chat as well as if anybody would like to, if they have any questions, to put their hand up. I'll have a look around. And Nick, maybe we can stop the screen share and then we'll be able to see more of the people. So is there anybody that has a question? And if not, I do have one that I could kick us off with. Let me see. I don't see anyone at the moment. But Nick and Mark, as you were talking and you were showing the discrete choice, sort of where people would choose this or that, it was reminding me of, could that potentially be modified to be used as a decision aid for potential participants when they're during informed consent during the process, like to help them to make the decision to participate? Because I saw things in there like, if you chose this treatment, potentially this would be the outcome, or that's what the evidence is showing. Has that been thought of or discussed at all?
Yeah, there's a bit of work I know about. I wouldn't know all the research, but I work quite closely with sort of patient decision aids, and there are people now developing those decision aids, for participation in trials. And I think that there are a lot of similarities, because in a sense, what you're trying to do is you're trying to inform people about what you might expect, which is challenging, right? And going into a trial, it's very hard to describe to patients what you might expect. And there's this whole fear of the unknown and the unfamiliar. And so there's time that's spent sort of describing those outcomes. And then sort of like providing this choice. This is the option that's available to you. And so I think the difference between, there are some similarities. The differences are that in the questions that we ask, we're providing a bit more hypotheticals. So we're sort of exploring what could be. So in terms of effect sizes, we would be asking sort of like effect sizes that actually may not be possible, like, or the intervention may not reasonably meet that, but we'll put that into our discrete choice, because then it will help tease out actually how big an effect size is required for people to actually take on this risk of a side effect. And so that's the sort of slight sort of nuance between that, because we're in a sense in this hypothetical stage, but at the end you could then create a decision aid with the sort of actual best guesses of what you're expecting to see.
Oh, great. That's really helpful. Yes. And distinguishing the differences between the two. I think maybe Melanie had a question first, then Jennifer, and then we have one or two in the chat. So Melanie, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to ask what the drawbacks you saw. I mean, what were the problems of having patient participation in the design? You've talked about the benefits. Were there any drawbacks or time constraints or problems that arose from your point of view?
Yeah, like it's great. It's a great great question. I'm involved in a few of these methods clustered sort of research studies, and we're sort of like, to be honest, we're doing this for many of us for the first time of like involving patients. It sounds crazy, but like this is a new thing for economists to be working with patient partners, and partly that's what we've been doing by having these types of projects. Like I can say that this project just went extremely well, and I think our patient partners were so helpful, and it really, I'll let Mark speak to it in a second and any other things. And not all projects have gone so smoothly, and partly it's about just sort of understanding everyone's role. There is that sort of like really unhealthy sort of power dynamic with all these projects, and sort of just being sort of upfront about who makes the decisions. I guess one observation I'd have on this, Mark, you want to pick up on it, it probably did slow us down a little bit, because in a sense, we were kind of keen, maybe we would have just carried on forward a bit quicker, but having the patient partner saying pause, they want to understand exactly what's going on before we move forward, it potentially did slow things down a bit. But at the benefit has been we probably ended up with a much more relevant and better product in the end. So again, there's trade-offs in that. Mark, anything else to add on this?
Yeah, it's like as Nick said, it was like a very powerful and valuable experience that we had. So it's difficult to sort of think about things that didn't go well, because I think it went well. But I think one of the things that struck me, like a number of different stages in the process, was that the systems we have aren't really set up for patient involvement right from the outset. So you feel like a bit worried asking people to spend time sort of writing a research proposal that might not get funded, and then you're not sure how where you'll reimburse the time for, because you want to sort of respect people's time and make sure that they're sort of reimbursed for that time. And then I think the whole process as well, like Nick was saying that the time is one thing. Like if you're impatient, I don't think it's going to work. And we've done research in the past, as Nick says, where we've not fully included patients. And for example, with the focus groups that we ran, we would invite people to come and participate in Vancouver, and it seemed like quite a smooth process in the past. But we were challenged by our patient partners. You know, there's people who can't get to Vancouver who have very different perspectives and different experiences of healthcare, and so we kind of redesigned that process of focus groups to allow remote participation, which doesn't seem like a big deal in this world at the moment, but at the time it was kind of like a methodological shift about how do we use something like Zoom to get people in so they can give their perspectives wherever they are in the province, and we got a much broader representation of people's perspectives. And perhaps that's why some of the things that we might not have thought to be so important about the support for people from multidisciplinary teams and the logistics and the costs came through more strongly than they perhaps would do. And then I think the other thing on the time front was that you kind of realize, going back to the systems as well that we have set up, that we kind of expect to work in the times that are more convenient for us, and you have to redesign your workday in a lot of ways to make it work. So we were having meetings in sort of evenings and weekends, and realizing that if you're going to involve patient partners, that they have day-to-day lives that they're dealing with, and then they've got their condition to manage as well. So you have to sort of be a lot more flexible and a lot more patient, but I think the rewards are kind of hugely valuable, and it's been a really exciting and insightful project from our perspective.
Thank you.
Jennifer, did you still have a question?
Yes, thanks, Alison. Thanks, Nick and Mark. That was a really interesting presentation, and the findings definitely have me kind of thinking about how they might apply to kind of older adults and exercise interventions. But I was just wondering if you might be able to comment on how you suggest kind of resolving the disconnect between kind of the pressure to demonstrate traditional trial outcome metrics and then kind of this movement towards considering this maybe complementary approach that integrates patients. You know, in considering that, do you think there's maybe a need for you know, establishing what might be considered measures for success from the patient perspective that maybe could complement the traditional outcome metrics?
Thanks, Jen. That's a tricky question to answer, but I think it is changing. It is changing the dynamic of what is defining success. I think this stuff should be happening earlier. Like, the thing that's frustrating is that when you have a trial that reports, and you could have told from the start, before this trial even started recruiting, that actually the results were not necessarily set up in a way that were going to be useful. And that's just so frustrating. You know, that patients who participate in this trial of a design that we know is probably not going to impact practice. And so I think the impact of this I see as more relevant at sort of like the design or the funding stage of a trial. And like our barriers for funding a trial should change, and they shouldn't just be based on the correct sort of statistics for effect size or things like this. They need to sort of demonstrate that actually this trial will have value beyond the end. And I do think that would be a new metric. Like it's somewhat considered in sort of peer review of trials. And I guess here we're talking about publicly funded trials. I see there's a question in the chat about kind of private funded studies, but for a publicly funded study, I just think this should be a criteria that is considered in that before it's even funded. And I haven't really thought about it. Well, I have thought about it. Is it different from a private versus public perspective? It would be my sort of like response to that.
Thanks, Nick.
So Nick or Mark, there was that comment in the chat around, the industry funded trials. And I mean, I suppose there's an economic argument here to make that this could save them a lot of money in that feasibility and planning stage. And there's also some international guideline changes at the ICH that will be coming requiring patient input into the earliest stages of the industry trial planning. So do you have thoughts on like how do we sort of bring these methods to those industry and pharma companies?
Yeah, I think it relates. It's interesting those changes like that are coming. They're not very well defined. So, and I think it links to Ben's question here about what is patient involvement, and people have very different sort of views and definitions of that. And I think probably pharma companies will take a view on that. I think what we're sharing here is a method that could be part of that, but that's not the only. This is, just to be clear, just this part of what patient involvement in a trial design would be. There's all sorts of other perspectives and places that patients can be involved in. I had an interesting chat with someone in pharma, and they claimed publicly that they do a lot of market research, but mostly it's with clinicians, it's with the prescriber. That's in the end who's going to use this sort of like promote this treatment. And until things change such that patients have a bit more autonomy in the sense of how that how they can choose the treatments that they're provided, that may not change quite quickly. But I do think what we have in one sense is we can help if somebody has a design of a trial and they're worried about sort of how many people they might recruit. I think we could quickly inform them of how many people they might recruit, and actually what tweaks, the impact of tweaking the design might have on their recruitment rates. And I think that will be practical for public and private sort of trials moving forward.
Absolutely. So highlighting that practical application and is really important. So I know we only have about a minute left, and I'm wondering, Mark and Nick, would you be willing to answer, if we save the chat questions, to answer those at a later date, those ones that you sort of had some commentary on, and we could share that back with the attendees?
Absolutely. I'm just going to put my email again in the chat. Mark, you could do that the same. But please feel free also to sort of connect with me if you've got any questions. And yeah, we'd be happy to answer any of these beyond this time.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again both for presenting this work to us today. And it's been a fantastic discussion as well. Really appreciate it. And I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of the day. And yes, I'll leave this open. I see, Bev, you've got a question too. I'll stay on for a little bit and keep the chat open if anybody would like to add some more questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And I look forward to continuing to sort of engage with these discussions over the next coming months. Thanks so much for your time.